Disruption.
Well, welcome everybody. I am stoked to have with us a dear friend, going back 10 plus years by now, I think.
It's been a while.
It has been a while. Aaron Frank. We're going to talk about all things, and I'm really curious what term you're actually using for this, and you will explain that in a minute. All things augmented virtual reality, whatever the term du jour is. Very briefly about Aaron. Aaron is a seasoned researcher, writer, consultant with nearly a decade of experience in Silicon Valley. Actually, I think it's more than a decade by now. Most recently as principal faculty at Singularity University. He does extensive writing, and his writing was featured in Vice magazine, Wired UK, Forbes, VentureBeat, and regularly on Singularity Hub. He advises large corporations, startups, government organizations on emerging technologies with a specific focus on the topic we're talking about today. Where I and he met was in his role as a very early employee at Singularity University, where he drove early stage growth through business development and strategic partnerships. Also want to point out, Aaron completed fairly recently an MBA from University of Oxford. Aaron, I'm stoked to have you.
I'm super excited to be here. I have been looking forward to this. It's been on my calendar, X on the day, so I'm happy for this.
Cool. First question I have, what term are we actually using these days?
Okay, so I'm glad you started there, and I saw that Jeff Rogers posted in the in chat that fun party trick, try to get him to say metaverse. I think this is a really important place to start, and somewhere when I work with my clients is actually kind of a challenge, because I'll just start at the top that a lot of what we're going to talk about has kind of fallen under the label of this term, the metaverse, over the last few years. And there was a lot, of course, this hype cycle and a lot of attention afforded to this term. I don't think it's a very helpful term. I don't like the word. And the reason I don't like the term metaverse is that it's a very imprecise term. Like many people have very different associations in their mind when they hear the term metaverse. For example, if you're a marketing person, you hear the term metaverse, you immediately think of, brand activations and Roblox as, these virtual worlds. Or if you're a business operations person, you hear the term metaverse, you're thinking digital twins for, industrial settings and monitoring your supply chains or whatever it is. And the issue is that those very different kinds of initiatives will get rolled up to senior leadership and referred to as a metaverse initiative. So your question is a good one. My advice to my clients is that we're still at a time where these technologies are new enough where you kind of have to go through the tedious process of being a little more descriptive. So if you're using augmented or virtual reality, call it that. If you're using game engines to build a digital twin, sort of refer to it as that. If you're doing a brand activation in Roblox, refer to them as virtual worlds. So I don't really have this sort of like umbrella term. The last thing I'll say on this point is another term that has started to become quite well known is this idea of spatial computing. And of course, this is the term that Apple has identified as the way to refer to these technologies. I actually really like that term. That's not an Apple invention. This is a term that has been used in my industry, in this space, not just by myself, but by many others for nearly a decade, at least like the last 7 or 8 years. Spatial computing, I think the reason it's such a good term is broadly what all of these technologies share in common is as a computing interface, it makes use of 3-dimensional space. You're engaging with a computing environment that allows you to make use of space, moving around in space. And so spatial computing, I think, is actually kind of a helpful label, at least in reference to the interface. But yeah, so I think we're still kind of at a point where we have to, it's tedious, but we need to describe what we mean when we talk about these technologies. I haven't found the one sort of label to rule them all so far, I guess.
It's also interesting to see that Apple actually adopted this term spatial computing really to talk about their product, the Vision Pro, which gets me to another interesting point. I'm curious, where do you actually see the industry being at the moment? So we had the Oculus Rift, the moment of VR becoming real, then Meta acquired Oculus. Google Glass and the glass hole stories, Microsoft HoloLens, which brought us into the world of AR, but it didn't. The Magic Leap crash and burn crazy story, and now the Vision Pro, $3,500 later. Where are we?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting time, but it's interesting because in some way, it's kind of the industry is sort of just on this progression, and it's the Apple Vision Pro is just the next device in a long line of previous devices, and there's some slight new exciting differences which we can talk about. But on the other hand, the fact that Apple has entered the space, just by the fact that it's Apple, is a huge sort of turning point. Not about the hardware, not because the technology is incredibly new and different than what has come before, but of course Apple, for a while, I don't know where they are in the rankings now, largest company in the world. When they do something, that matters. And Apple has been quietly working on this device for at least the last 7 or 8 years. They've had many acquisitions, thousands of engineers, or at least hundreds of engineers, thousands of patents to create this device. And so of course the marketplace is going to stop and pay attention. So in terms of like where we are, in some sense it's a big turning point, but in terms of like hardware development, it's kind of just we're climbing up the progress ladder a bit. There's a lot to be excited about with the Vision Pro, but there's also, I think, a bit of a hype cycle around some of the device as well. So yeah, it's an interesting moment, but yeah, it's tough to kind of parse out.
I'd be curious in terms of devices specifically. So talking Vision Pro, the Oculus devices, but also augmented reality glasses. Bara, who used to run Oculus under Meta, recently posted a very long, very thoughtful piece on how he perceives the Vision Pro, what the shortcomings are, what is great about it. And he makes this really interesting comment about very specifically saying it's ultimately a glorified developer preview product, right? It's very good. It has like lots of technical capabilities. Do you agree in terms of like overall, not just looking at the Vision Pro, but like the whole pool of devices? Is this still in this phase of like it's all like essentially developer previews? Or do you really think that we're getting to this point where it's like, it's kind of at the tipping point where it really becomes like a thing?
Yeah, I really, if anyone hasn't read that article, and you and I had discussed it in the preceding days to this, I really agree with that sentiment, which is also interesting just from a business strategy perspective to explore, like, because this is not a thing that Apple typically does. They don't typically launch this sort of like unproven kind of like very expensive experiment. They're very good at being really well designed, not even fast followers, but just followers in general. Once they let the other companies kind of like work through the kinks. So this is unique for Apple to be doing. And I do agree that it is a bit of a developer kit. We can talk about the hardware. There's a lot to sort of unpack about some of the design decisions that Apple made in developing this. But I think in sort of parsing out the question, which is a really good one that you're asking, is like, where are we in terms of a tipping point? It's not really about the hardware. It's about how are we actually using this device? It's asking the question, like, why are these devices useful? And that is a question that every single company in this space has been asking for at least the last decade. It's a question that basically, Facebook was asking when they acquired Oculus. And we're starting to get to, at least for me, I think there's a bit of like focus coming into, it's coming into focus to figure out what these devices are useful for. But I think, I think that is a more interesting place to explore, unpacking where we're going to see the tipping point. The last thing, and we can unpack some of this in either direction. I don't think that this device is that like iPhone moment, tipping point, broad consumer use. And actually, the more time I spend in this space, and there's a really nice quote that if you're familiar with, if you know Jeremy Bailenson at Stanford, who runs what's called the Virtual Human Interaction Lab. So he's been in the space for 2 decades or more. He gave an interview to the to the Washington Post, and he has this really pithy quote where he's like, "Look, the Vision Pro is an amazing device, and we should be using it, but we should be using it hardly at all." And I think what he means by this is that there are some very specific use cases that a device like the Vision Pro is incredibly useful for, and we're starting to understand where those are. But I think what should be kind of worrying to a company like Apple and Meta is that the total addressable market for those use cases is very likely much smaller than what Mark Zuckerberg or Apple is trying to convince the world, that these devices are going to completely replace and take over all of our computing lives. So I think to figure out where we are in terms of a tipping point, we have to ask the question, how and why are these devices useful, and where are they useful, and how do we use them, basically?
Which is an interesting question. If you think about that, the largest, if you want to say so, metaverse experiences or whatever, like virtual worlds, right, is Roblox, Fortnite, essentially games, virtual world games, which are experienced on a device which is flat, 2D. So do you think that the venue, the moving towards, or this fascination with like moving towards a device other than the devices we already have, flat like screens essentially, is actually somewhat misguided? Because clearly like the consumer sentiment seems to be, I'm actually totally fine experiencing this on my phone or tablet or PC.
I think you're bringing up such an important point. So I'll go into that. I think what's also important, just a way to organize our thinking about this space, is that we have to be very clear that there's two different directions that these devices, that we can talk about where and how these devices are useful. One is on the enterprise side. So if I'm an employee at a company, how are businesses using this device? That is a very different discussion than, at least in this example that you're bringing in with on the consumer side, how are consumers using this device? And I'll just say, like, Apple is really interesting because I don't think Apple knows which market they're going after. They're trying to go after both. Like I'm talking to clients who are getting pitched, the Vision Pro for enterprise, and I'm, it's interesting hearing what those discussions are like. But then the average consumer is being flooded with like, these devices are going to transform your way of like watching movies and hanging out with friends and playing games. So on the consumer side, I think you're exactly right to call out that we already have these, what I would identify them as a form of spatial computing, like a Roblox. It's the difference between something like Zoom, which is a flat 2D interface, and even though it's still a screen-based interface, something like Roblox has the qualities of being able to move around in space as an avatar with other people, which absorbs a lot of the social dynamics of being in the real world. So I think you're right to call this out, that there's a lot of issues that on the consumer side, these devices will need to overcome, mainly being that once you put this device on, you're sort of removed from your surroundings, or your relationship to your physical environment around you has been transformed. And until we overcome the sort of the disconnect between the user and their physical surroundings, this is why I think I don't think we're going to see people, broadly in mainstream use using the Vision Pro at their local coffee shop or on airplanes, as much as there will be some early adopters that do that, and people will give them strange looks and for cultural reasons. But I think you're right that flat screen-based interfaces for accessing these kinds of games and experiences are the dominant user interface for now. And I think that it's a very different thing to use these spatial computers, or whatever we call them, like an Apple Vision Pro. It's a different experience. Like playing Roblox in a Vision Pro I'm not convinced that is a much more compelling experience than just doing it on a flat screen. So I think you're right to call that out.
Talking about the device side a little bit more, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on Meta on one hand went so full in the virtual environments, three-dimensional, deeply immersive virtual environments, that they even changed the name of the company. And then on the flip side, and they invest lots of money and they've got a headset, etc. And then on the flip side of that, they did a partnership with Ray-Ban to create essentially what is like a very light touch augmented reality device, which in its latest incarnation, the sunglasses, is actually really fascinating product. As in, it has a camera, it has speakers and microphones. It's connected to Meta's AI, or is going to be connected to Meta's AI, and can act as a portal into like connecting your AI, or Meta's AI in this case, with the real world. I'd be curious to hear, like, where do you see this falling, like this distinction? Is this like you will have both these devices in the world? Is this Meta hedging their bets? Is one more likely to win in your eyes?
Yeah, it's interesting because for I would say, 7, 8, years ago, a decade ago, there was a very clear distinction between devices that we would classify as virtual reality versus
Mhm.
devices that we would classify as augmented reality. And the difference being, virtual reality, you're fully immersed, you're inside the world, whereas augmented reality, you're still situated within your environment, but you're augmenting that through, most people associate it with visual information like Google Glass, but you're right so the Ray-Bans are interesting because it's very much an audio based augmented reality. Now, I want to come back to that point because I think that is an interesting distinction. In terms of what's happening today, is like the dominant design that is starting to take over the marketplace is this merger between what used to be this augmented reality or virtual reality versus augmented reality, and that's because of what's called pass through. So the Quest 2, I think, was like the first consumer device that really built on this idea. But basically, or they're not the first. There are other devices that have done this. But basically, the idea is that there are cameras on the front of the device that record the world, and then the screen that you're seeing is a sort of like a recording of the world. So those cameras sort of become your eyes, and then the device can layer information on top of it. This is exactly how the Vision Pro works. So this idea of what's called pass through is starting to blur this distinction between augmented and virtual reality. So in the future, I think the holy grail of this whole space, and I think we're a very long way away from this because of a lot of the engineering challenges, is like one device that's capable of being this, sleek pair of glasses that can go, fully immersive, but also, allows you to sort of like maintain your relationship to the physical world. The final thing I really want to just briefly touch on, and the Ray-Ban example is interesting, is, and I'm borrowing this as an idea. I remember I first read about this idea from a futurist named John Smart. I actually, you might know him, Pascal. He used to be around Singularity World, but he wrote this. He wrote an article, I think like 7 or 8 years ago, where he basically tried to make the argument that any kind of visual-based augmented reality for everyday use is unlikely to ever really take off as a mainstream phenomenon, because having visual information all day long is a very distracting way to live your life. It'll be very useful for specific use cases. If you're a manufacturing, technician doing assembly, if you're a fighter pilot, yeah, that makes sense. But if you're just like going grocery shopping, it's not necessarily this like compelling experience. But we tend to forget that a very reasonable way to define augmented reality is something that gives you information through audio. So when you're walking around a street and you have Google Maps telling you, how to get somewhere, turn right at the street, that's a form of augmented reality. And, people might be familiar with the film Her. I think that is a really interesting depiction of a kind of augmented reality interface, having a relationship with a computer that can speak to you. It's far less distracting. And what's interesting is like the Ray-Ban glasses are, I think, working at trying to resolve the cultural barrier to wearing a computer all day long. So like Google Glass was a problem because people were freaked out by this weird cyborg looking person recording you. It's got a little like camera light, like looking at the world. People don't want to be around someone like that. But look at, like, even Apple's done this. Like I'm wearing AirPods right now. They're working on resolving this cultural norm where it's not weird for me to wear a computer, on my head all day long. So it's the cultural barrier to these kinds of systems is a huge thing that needs to be overcome. And the Ray-Ban glasses or AirPods are a really interesting design approach where it's audio-based augmented reality. And I think that could actually be a far more compelling experience long, into the future than anything, visual that we'll be wearing, for mainstream use.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. I remember literally a decade ago, I was in Hamburg using a tour guide app on my phone, which was GPS connected essentially, and kept telling me, like, if you turn left, you will see the old Rathaus, and like, here's a couple of facts about it. And it was a really interesting, magical experience. And you're still really immersed in your real world. So, yes, fascinating point. I'd be curious before I open it up, and I want to open the floor up to our esteemed audience here. But before I do this, if you could summarize a little bit, what is your best advice at the moment, given where we are in terms of where the industry is, where the industries might go in the future? For us as a leader, like, how should we think about this? What should we do, and what should we consider?
Yeah, I think it's almost okay. So I think it's the same answer whether I'm speaking to like a business audience. So if I were speaking to one of my clients in a business context, I think I would have the same answer if I were speaking to like an individual who's just sort of like a curious consumer. But I'll focus more on the business side because I can be a little harsher in my answer here, which is it's really shocking to me as I spend more time with, business communities, how often it is, and Pascal, I know you've experienced this, and I know you see this, and you see it with other technology domains, is how often everyone just starts like frothing at the mouth at the latest hype, right? Like everyone's right now is like, what's our AI strategy? What, like, we need to deploy AI. Like, how are we like engaging with AI? And like a couple years ago, I saw this with the metaverse. And what was really shocking to me is how quickly we forget to focus on what problem are you trying to solve? Like what, like we seem to want to focus on the shiny toy, but what problem are you trying to solve? It's very possible that these technologies have nothing to do with the problem you're trying to solve. And so keeping that as a leader, if you can do that, if you can keep focus on sort of the purpose of what you're trying to resolve, then you can work backwards from, okay, maybe a digital twin actually helps us, monitor or manage whatever system we're doing, or we have like a robotics platform in our warehouse that keeps like injuring workers. We need more training data. We should train that in simulation, like what NVIDIA is working on. On the consumer side, it's a little different, but it's kind of the same thing. It's what are you hoping to get from using these technologies? I think for me, the thing that gets me excited about these technologies is like, I'm not a gamer. I own a Quest 3 more out of a professional obligation than any kind of like recreational use. The thing that I use my device for, and what I think would be the thing that drives a lot of adoption, is we should, on the consumer side, think about these technologies as a new kind of a communication tool. When you can comfortably spend time with other people, that's the thing that will unlock the value of these devices. So for an example, I play, there's a game called 11, I forget it's a table tennis. It's like 11 something. I forget the name of the specific game, but I have friends from undergrad, like college, that also have this device that it's more of like a way to hang out with them, doing a shared activity. That is, and I can think in the context of my parents who are, in their mid to late 70s, that they're not technology early adopters. The first tablet computer, iPad that they ever got was for one reason, and it was because they wanted to FaceTime with their grandchildren. And so when these devices become a compelling way to spend time with other people, I think that will be the sort of the use case. I know I kind of deviated from your very good question, which is, as a leader, how should we be engaging with it? I think just focusing on the use case. Like, why do I want, if I'm a gamer, I go crazy. These devices are great for specific types of gaming. If you want to just like watch movies on like a big screen, I'm a little less convinced that that's going to be like a compelling use case. But as long as you're focusing on like why you want to spend time in these environments, I think that's the right way to focus on it, rather than just like chasing after the latest shiny, hype phenomenon.
Perfect. On those words, let me open up the floor to our friends here. As usual, we are in a small enough group. We are good friends already. Just come on mic. If you've got questions, comments, anything you want Aaron to elaborate, all yours. Floor is yours. And Richard, I'd be curious to hear, you said you are metaverse averse, if I can put you on the spot, my friend. I know that, and for the benefit of everybody who doesn't know Richard, he's an architect and runs an architecture studio in Canada. I know that you're using virtual reality in your practice. So in many ways, you are not metaverse averse, hopefully.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. Really fascinating insight into the topic at the highest level, including, what terminology, how do we describe it? How do we even talk about what this is, right? And yeah, we've kind of had one of everything. We had a developer kit for the original Oculus Rift, and it was tethered, right? And the clients thought it was fun, but it was very insular. We had to take turns and do it one at a time. And so, we've continued to experiment and play with it. Like, I really appreciated your distinction between consumer applications and more directed industry business applications, that we're playing around with. I do have one incredible use case of the most amazing use. Like, I think it's just, the as you say, you have the Oculus 3.
I have a Quest 3, yeah.
Quest 3. I've seen incredible use. We happen to do a lot of work in elder care, and it's being used as therapy for people with dementia, right? And I think some people just thought, well, let's try it. And I guess it is astounding how it can, calm individuals down and put them in a familiar environment. And they don't have that sort of hang up with the interface that you might think. The other side of that coin is I've seen demonstrations using it to train care partners and have them experience what dementia is sort of like.
Oh, wow.
And how you hear weird sounds and you don't see the environment properly. So it's good for empathy training. Isn't that an amazing specific example?
Yeah.
So I totally agree that it's
great.
more these really specific, like you say, what's the problem? What's the need we have? But my question for you is, we don't think we haven't been able to get it out there and use it for client interaction to the extent we had hoped. And I think there's two big problems: is it's just bulky and eye fatigue. So how solvable are those problems?
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing all those insights, and it's actually, you're raising. I pity the marketing manager at a tech company whose job it is to go to the trade shows and get people in and out of VR headsets all day long, which sounds like you've experienced as well. Just as a barrier to getting these in the hands of clients. There's such a friction with working with these devices as they are today. And actually, I'd love to continue. I would love to ask you about, your sort of perspective from an architect, because that, for me, just as a non-architect, I'm not an architect, but I could imagine that, having the ability to sort of plan, design, think about things in three-dimensional space is a very different cognitive process than looking at, 2D blueprints and so forth. So, like, an industrial designer, or a civil planner, or an architect, for me, is actually one category that I'm expecting will be like a super valuable use case.
All our work is in 3D. So-called CAD doesn't happen anymore. It's building information modeling. So we all work in fully 3D environments, just on a two-dimensional screen. So I do see an application where you can be like a little, micro drone, and you can fly in above the ceiling and check a detail or look at something, but for our own use, that we need to check something that specifically. So I do think those are the applications I see before we have, every client in the room with a headset on.
Which is a really exciting, use case. But I think what's interesting from a business strategy point of view is that use case is probably a much smaller market than what Facebook anticipated when they spent $2 billion acquiring, or what Apple has spent however much money building this headset. Just on, and I want to address the screen or the eye fatigue just in a minute. But I remember hearing many years ago there was an architecture firm that built schools like for elementary schools, and one just to connect it into the point you're making about empathy. One of the things that they were able to do is actually set the user height at like 5 feet or 4 feet or whatever, so you could walk around the school and experience it as like a kindergartner. So this ability to sort of give the decision makers, adults, they, want to build something through the eyes of adults for the end user, which is, a child. So kind of connecting the point that I think you made really well about the ability to create empathy. Just briefly on the eye fatigue, this is probably actually one of the points that, and Bara goes into this at pretty great depth in his article about one of the biggest breakthroughs with the Vision Pro is screen resolution. So there's a really good long form, I think it's an MIT Tech Review article that looks exactly at the breakthrough in the micro OLED approach that Apple took with this device. They're not the only VR headset that uses this new kind of micro OLED. The thing that's really sort of like gets talked about or sexy is what's called pixel density. So Apple doesn't use the term retina resolution. Actually, Pascal, this is one thing that this is something that I'm very, it's curious to me that this isn't a comparison that I see other people make. There's another company called Vario. It's a Finnish company that makes a really high-end device. They've been around for a long time. What's different than Apple is they don't go after consumers. They're an enterprise headset. Today, their like leading device is roughly the same cost. And in fact, it has a higher pixel density than the Apple Vision Pro. Like Apple Vision Pro has like 23 million pixels. The Vario XR4 has 28 million. So it's even higher pixel density. So we have a device that's been on the market for a long time that is very like similar, comparable. But I've tried the Vario, spent time in it, and the eye fatigue issue is real. But that is really hopefully a product of just creating a pixel density that our eyes at that close just cannot sort of perceive the distinction between the pixels. There's other things that will need to be addressed through like software. There's something called foveated rendering, which is a really fancy way of saying that the device can track where your eyes are looking and only spend the computational power rendering at high quality where you're looking. So it saves power on the device and it creates a much better experience for your eyes to look at, very high resolution. So foveated rendering is kind of like a software trick that can help with this, that companies are still experimenting with. So we're not completely resolved on the dominant design for this, but this is an issue that companies definitely know they need to overcome. And I think this is one where we'll see progress over the coming years to resolve that kind of eye fatigue issue that you're raising.
I want to bring Heather on deck here. She raised her hand, and also just want to briefly mention Rob made a point here about the addictive element of screens ultimately, and if we're entering an even worse era of screen addiction when we tether our screens like directly to our eyeballs, essentially.
Yeah, well, I want to be clear. Like when I speak about this topic in a corporate setting or to audiences, I try to make the point very clearly that I am not someone who advocates that these technologies should, like the aspiration should not be to sort of replace our existing reality. We should not. This is the thing that confuses me about Facebook's or Zuckerberg's positioning in this space, is that the concept of the metaverse comes from dystopian film, Snow Crash, where the concept is this like, this society that thing. It's like the metaverse originally was conceived as this thing meant to like inspire, like horror, and all of these, tech companies try to convince us that we should be running as quickly as we can to like spend time in these spaces. For me, anytime I spend more than 30 to 45 minutes in a VR device, I have to go outside and just look at a tree. Like it just I share some of the same concerns. I think for me, the biggest question around how we deploy these systems is like we already live in a world where, you know, our screens are basically being operated within a system of, you know, profit that hijacks our dopamine systems for, you know, for profit, basically. Our attention being, you know, jacked into these, you know, infinite scroll feeds. I do worry about the types of business models that define how we deploy an even more invasive interface, something that you wear all day long. So data privacy has a huge part of this, but like, yeah, addiction and there's a huge amount of ethical questions that should be resolved through sort of like regulatory thinking that I don't think governments around the world, that in my experience, have spent enough time thinking about. There are some, actually, Pascal, Germany is one. So they've actually had some interesting and sophisticated discussions and explorations of how to regulate this specific type of computing interface around data privacy, around how companies can deploy them. But yeah, the question is that's being raised is a super, super important one. But yeah, I don't want to take time from Heather now, so I'll pause.
Thank you. So I'm really curious about what work is potentially being done about creating frameworks for the spatialization of information itself. And by that, I mean, you know, we talk about enterprise solutions that might connect, say, like a handbook or instruction to a particular object in space. But what about actually creating knowledge management systems and like spaces? So how do you potentially drop into like a relational database that, you know, like is helpful for organizing project management, organizing and visualizing complex information sets? Like, I don't want to live in the metaverse, but when I'm like working on research, I would like love to like live in that environment for a bit. Like, I don't know, go live in my own rhizome, so to speak.
I will say I don't have a satisfying answer, but I love the question, and you're sort of stimulating really interesting. Yeah, it's a really, really interesting question. My short answer is I'm not intimately familiar with any kind of like standardized approach to the kinds of things you're talking about. My sense is that what I've seen a lot of companies do is that every company does it differently. And this is where deployment and implementation is the hardest part about integrating these technologies into an enterprise. And these are not technology questions. Like, in some sense, the technology itself is like the easiest part. It's like you get an IT person to come and, you know, anchor some handbook to a specific object or whatever. Like, that's not difficult to do. What you're raising is a really interesting question, is being thoughtful in the sort of the way in which you deploy, like the total sort of, you know, because it intersects with, you know, culture. It intersects with, you know, different departments within an organization are going to have different needs. Every, you know, as an individual, you know, you might want to relate to your space in a different way than someone else. So as a personal individual, I think that, you know, what will be really exciting is when the tools become far easier to work with, to be able to design for your own personal benefit the kind of, you know, relational database kind of space that you're, you know, talking about, whether you're creating a workstation for yourself. And, you know, I work better when I have my spreadsheets over here and my Spotify over here, and I keep all my distractions to like my 360. So I have to physically turn around to get to them. In terms of like a more industrial setting, this is really tough. This is where you need like an excellent operator to deploy this stuff. I don't know of any sort of best practices or research. Actually, the one company that I can think of that might be a really interesting resource to go and check out, and I know they have some sort of free resources, is a company called Scope AR, which is a company that builds these kinds of, you know, anchoring knowledge sets to specific assets within a factory setting. They have some sort of like best practices, like white papers, which I actually have not read. I have bookmarked them for myself to read myself. They would probably be an interesting organization that has learned a lot about the kind of thing you're raising. I don't know of any sort of standardized frameworks or people thinking about it or doing research in it. But my sense is that every company does it differently. Every company is probably figuring it out as they go. but it's a super, super interesting question that you're raising. It's really, yeah, it's really intriguing to think about.
Yeah, thank you for those resources. And I'm going to check out Scope, and shout out to Richard for referencing Sherlock Holmes' Mind Palace. Like, I think that's very fun. And, you know, there's like some history on like other cultures, like having like memory walks and stuff like that. So like spatializing your own memory, I think is really interesting. So
yeah, this is it intersects with so much sort of like cognitive psychology and all like brain science, all these other things. It's super interesting to see sort of like how we relate to physical space informs, you know, how we make use of that space. And these technologies sort of, for the first time in a sense, sort of confronts us with having to be thoughtful of how we design not physical infrastructure, like what, you know, an architect would do, like what sounds like Richard does, but, you know, from, you know, programmers, software developers, you know, digital environments that inform how we relate to space. Pokemon Go is also another interesting to think about, because that, you know, that is it's like a meaning making myth machine that transforms how we relate to like the physical world, where you go, why you go there. You know, when I used to play Pokemon Go, when the Harry Potter game came out, I remember showing up to this place in Pokemon Go, and then a bunch of other people that were clearly playing, and I was like, oh, are you guys here to catch the whatever? And they're like, no, we're playing Harry Potter. It was like two different narrative universes descending on the same physical location, and just like different realities, you know, making sense of physical space in an interesting way. So I think, yeah, like you're raising such an interesting question. This could like endless numbers of PhDs to think about how we design space and make use of it.
Aaron, can I briefly piggyback on something? You talked about resources, you know, and short of us reaching out to you and asking you tons of hopefully good questions, do you have any good resources for this community to kind of just stay like abreast of what's happening in the space? Is there any good newsletters or websites you follow or people you follow?
So there's an event. So there's one event that I go to every year that I become like a student. It's called AWE, Augmented World Expo, and they have some local meetups in different cities. So that, you know, that's not kind of a scalable resource, but that's a group that I get a lot from. There's a website called Road to VR that I think does some pretty good coverage on this. The main editor is a guy named Ben Lang. He's a good Twitter follow. He writes, you know, pretty extensively. There's a podcast by a guy named Kent Bai. It's called Voices of VR, and he is an incredibly thoughtful sort of thinker in the space, like someone who does not get caught up in the hype, and kind of operates at a level of depth and introspection that I quite appreciate and enjoy. And he's got a huge catalog, over 1,000 episodes of different podcast episodes. And then for me, most of my, like, the way I stay like up to date is I've curated just like a Twitter feed of just a lot of different people, and Twitter for me is a great resource that a lot of the developers in the space like to post on. But those are a few resources. If I think of more, I don't know if there's like a show notes situation here, but I can pass on others.
No, this is great. Short of anyone having a specific comment or question, I'd love to dig and kind of like look at, you already mentioned Pokemon Go as a augmented reality experience, which is actually being played on a phone, on a flat screen. We talked earlier about Roblox and Fortnite, and we should add Minecraft, kind of like the like 3D environment for kids, to that. There's a lot happening in those environments. I mean, Fortnite is like gone through the roof. There's like massive concerts now, in like artists launching their stuff in Fortnite. No other than Paris Hilton, the heir to the Hilton empire, who also runs a media consulting business, just released a white paper on how we could use Roblox for brand activation, and gives an example of her own like her own brand activation inside of Roblox. What I find interesting is, so all of these platforms are more for kids and young adults. I'd be curious to hear Do you think that this will cross at one point? Particularly also as these young adults, like the Fortnite players, getting older. So do we see environments which are immersive like Roblox and Fortnite, etc., but really getting towards, more professional settings, more adult settings, quote to say?
Yeah, this is such a good question, and it gets back to the question you raised earlier about tipping points. Because the way I frame this, in a business, to a business client, is a lot of people were familiar during the metaverse hype cycle that JP Morgan, as was like an example that everyone was talking about. JP Morgan built this lounge in Decentraland, which was this virtual, space where you would go talk to a wealth advisor and learn about JP Morgan services. And the question that I had is, it's very obvious to us today that, millions of people are not ready to go and talk to a wealth advisor in the, metaverse or one of these virtual worlds. So the question is, when will that become a mainstream phenomenon? My sense of it, and I want to sort of preserve an ability to sort of change my mind in the future. And I've had this conversation with others. I've heard arguments in both directions. My sense of it is that in the future, if millions of, let's say, adults are using these kinds of what we would today associate as like kid-like platforms like Roblox and Minecraft, or using them for more like adult like in an adult setting, I don't think that it is because the technology gets better, which it will. Like, we all understand exponential growth curves, and, the Apple Vision Pro is $3,500 today. It'll be cheaper tomorrow, and it'll get better. But I don't think that is going to be the thing that like unlocks this mainstreamification of this phenomenon. What I think is more likely is that a whole generation of kids today growing up on a platform like, Roblox, have a completely different sensibility of what it means to spend time as an avatar online with their friends. Like, I have a 12-year-old niece and a 9-year-old nephew. My niece is in 7th grade, and I came home from I was visiting their house a couple of weeks ago, and she comes home from school and she sits down and immediately opens Minecraft on her iPad. I'm like, oh, you don't have homework to do today? You're just going to play games? And I was, just kind of like messing around with her, and she looks up at me and she's like, you need to back off. I'm doing my science homework. Apparently her science teacher had assigned some group project where they had to build some like chemistry demo in Minecraft or something. I was like, whoa, okay. I have a lot to learn here. And my 9-year-old nephew, like he goes to birthday parties in Roblox, and he's like, he wants his allowance paid in Robux or whatever. And that's, any parent of a, age appropriate kid will be familiar with the phenomenon that is Roblox. And so these are kids that like, it may, and this is a question I have, but it may be that when they're, of adult age and need to go talk to their wealth advisor at JP Morgan, that it won't be this weird, video game strange reality. And so there's definitely a cultural sort of intergenerational lens within which we need to sort of engage with exploring these very good questions you're raising, because a lot of this I don't think are technology questions. I think they're questions of culture and social, like how we socially construct, society in different ways. I've also heard the opposite. Like I know you're familiar with Philip Rosedale, the founder of Second Life. I spent a lot of time at the Linden Labs offices, and he's like set up this like lab co-working space for different people, and I go like once a week. We've talked about this. His argument is that we actually don't see the evidence. We don't see the evidence of kids in Roblox today, graduating out of Roblox into more sort of like professional adult like platforms. I don't know. I think it's a little too early to tell. Roblox is, if you look at their business strategy at the moment, they're very much trying to sort of develop worlds that sort of like age along with their user base. They're like going after platforms that are more suitable for, teens to early adults. So it's a great question. And I think, my hypothesis, until I'm proved otherwise, is that, when we look back in 15, 20 years, exactly like you're saying, I think that a whole generation of kids have been, sensitized to life online in a very different way than that our generation or our parents' generation would be familiar with.
That's awesome. Let me get Prisco on deck here. You've got your hand up. Luckily, the virtual hand, so like the blood doesn't completely run out of your physical one. Let me get you on deck and have you speak with Aaron.
Yeah, okay. Thank you for having me. What about performing arts and sports, for instance? You could engage old people like me. For instance, the experience of almost participating from on a watching a opera from the stage, or watching a soccer game from the pitch.
Yeah. So this is a use case that has been tested and has been around for quite a while, or at least since the beginning of these consumer devices. And so, like, an example is there was a company called Next VR, which had a partnership with the NBA to set up these cameras on the court side, these 360 cameras. So if you had a headset at home, could sit and watch a game from the court side. Or you're mentioning opera, so I haven't seen the performing arts in particular, but there's a lot of music venue, like concerts, where there's a company called or Melody VR was one. I don't know if it's still around, but they would just basically set up these cameras on the piano of like a Paul McCartney show, and you just watch from the stage. Basically, the thing that we're kind of is becoming clear many years into these experiments is that it's an incredible experience the first time you do it. The first couple times, there's this like initial sort of like wow factor, this like awe. And actually, Apple, if you go to an Apple store and you do their very curated demo for the Vision Pro, part of the demo is one of the most incredible examples of this kind of live sport from being there on the field as it's happening. They must have used like unbelievably expensive high resolution cameras to record basically stuff that we as average consumers are just not going to have access to for a while. The problem is, very quickly the wow factor wears off, and the issue becomes, unless you're able to experience those kinds of things with other people and feel like you're sharing the experience, it feels very isolating. And it's actually it becomes kind of it's not a compelling experience. The real thing to unlock this is when you can go to a game and feel like you're there, at mid-court or whatever, with your friends who are not physically in the same space as you, and you feel like you're there together. That is where it's more thinking of it as a communication tool, that sharing and spending time with others online. Just the initial like being there it's been around for a while, and it's very clear that the attrition rate is incredibly high. It's cool for a very short period of time, and then it kind of loses the wow factor.
Yeah.
Aaron, on that note, let us all get back to our loved ones, into the physical world. I highly recommend switch off your computer, go for a walk, meet someone in person. Aaron, I love this conversation, super insightful. We will make sure that people can follow you. What is, for the people on this call, what is the best way to stay in touch with you and follow you? What is your preferred channel outside of playing Pokemon Go with you?
I guess Twitter. I'll go with my Twitter. I'm not active. I need to be more, but like LinkedIn, Twitter would be the best. I don't post enough. Medium, but I don't post there. Twitter would be the place where I'd be happy to have anyone who wants to stay in touch or wants to get in touch with me. I'm happy to provide contact details, but yeah, Twitter or LinkedIn.
Fantastic. Well, Aaron, thank you so much. Everybody, thank you so much for joining us. Thanks for the thoughtful conversation and questions. This was great. We're going to release this as a podcasty thing. I'm also going to play around with having Claude AI summarize the speaking notes, so you get like highlights out of this here. Once again, my huge thank you and gratitude to Aaron. This was an amazing session. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Pascal.
Disruption.